And I go to the FEMA guy next and I said, "Is this your forklift?" And he goes, "No." And he said, and I said, "I need one though." He goes, "Well, you know what I'd do?" And I said, "Yeah." And I'm fixing to do just that, which means, unfortunately, there's two things. One, I just used fixing in a sentence when I'm not talking about repairing my car. So that's totally Southern, and I'm not totally Southern. So I'm embarrassed that I actually ever said that. So why I'm saying it on a podcast, I don't know. And then I realize I'm about to commit my first felony, grand theft forklift. So I go back to my engineers and I say, "Can anybody drive a forklift?" One of them says, "I can drive a forklift." And I do not ask to see his forklift license. That's good enough for me. You can drive a forklift. So he gets the forklift. We unload the light alls, and we only dropped one of them. Perfectly understandable. Lifted it from the wrong lift point, and it still worked afterwards. And nobody ever billed me for it, so that wasn't a problem. And we set up light alls around the clover leaves, and we now had a 24-hour chopper pad.
So today we're talking long promised light attack, and you have taken a leaf out of your friend and fellow Wild Weasel pilot his book, the Spike Benishek presentation book. Did you ever get the 2000 hours PowerPoint presentation patch?
No, I'm not sure I have oh, I must have 2,000 hours. I have a patch somewhere. Obviously, I don't wear it. It's embarrassing. I mean, yes, I can say, "Hey, I was a staff officer." Woohoo. Although this episode is going to talk a lot about staff stuff, I'm just trying not to make it as boring, pointless, and ultimately futile as it actually is.
Okay, well, you're selling it. And if I leave to make a cup of tea, you know you've lost me. So, but this episode actually, I'm genuinely interested in it. So, as everybody will notice from behind us, there are some Beach King Air, I think is the platform, and behind me is an MC12. I'm not sure exactly what's behind you. I don't know if that's an MC12 as well, some derivative. But you are going
No,
to
it's an
talk us through.
RC12D
That's an
horned
RC.
owl, which will be part of the discussion.
Okay. Well, I'm really looking forward to getting stuck in because it's always interesting to talk about things I know a little bit about, but this is something I know almost nothing about. Hacker Haskin, he came on the channel, talked a little bit about the MC12 operating it in Afghanistan. I know that we're going to do this in two parts, Starbaby. So we're going to do Iraq first, and then you'll come back and you'll do a part two on Afghanistan.
Right, and then we'll end up doing a part 3 on the light attack experiments, and that will come with video.
Going to say, when are we going to get to see your weapon systems video? But you've just answered the question.
A little background, a little refresher. When we last left my career, which was more or less in the toilet, I had ended up Allied Force, flying Strike Eagles. I was at the top of my game, and I got out of the Air Force and went into the National Guard because the Air Force elected to send me to fly EA-6B Prowlers. It was the wrong time for me to think about it. I was the most deployed aviator in 2 squadrons for 6 years. I was over 150 combat missions. I needed a staff job. But the Air Force is terrible at talent management, and they destroyed their EWO force in the 90s and early 2000s, sending their fighter EWOs to Prowlers. And my answer was that, I didn't graduate number 1 in my class to fly an airplane with a pointy end in the back. So I went out, I went into the Guard, was in the DC Guard for a year. They were actually pretty good to me, and then ended up on the staff in the reserves in Checkmate. So Checkmate is one of those, storied organizations that really is a internal think tank and planning organization. And one of its key purposes is to allow the air staff to meddle in the affairs of combatant commanders. And so I was there, and they were also good to me. And then I got an opportunity to write my own ticket back into the Skunks. So I refer to this year, this is 2000, as my penalty year in industry, okay, which I'm in the Guard, a part-timer, but got an opportunity, the skunkworks. We've all heard about it. It's Lockheed Martin's facility in Palmdale, California. That is not the part, the skunkworks, that I was part of, because in 1966, that was secret. And so General Clay formed an internal think tank in the Pentagon And he called it the skunkworks because he could steal the name because the name was secret. So we have a skunk. There are two skunkworks. One's in the Pentagon. One builds airplanes and is essentially the Kelly Johnson legacy organization. And the skunkworks is in the Pentagon is small. It's an Air Force organization. It's supposed to be packed with strategic thinkers, most of whom are graduates of the School of Advanced Air Power Studies. But there was a momentary condition in which they were understaffed. And they basically dropped the standards so far that I was able to get in. And because they also needed an electronic warfare officer. And actually, I think they'd have taken a zombie off the freaking street if he had a security clearance. It didn't smell too bad because the ventilation sucked in the Pentagon in 2000. And so I got into the skunkworks on 6-month orders, determined to make myself indispensable. And get my orders extended because this was my backwards ass way of getting back on active duty. But in the reserve component, you can be full time, but the reserves don't really get a say in your assignment or where you move. It's self-directed career path. So this way I could throw out the television boxes. I would never have to pack up the television again. I could live wherever I wanted. And so the latter 2/3 of my career, so 20 of my 32 years are in the reserve component where they couldn't tell me where to go. And, that's when I did my 2 ground combat assignments. That's where I did the light attack experiment out of that. And we'll all cover this later. And this is going to be an unusual episode because it talks a lot about my first ground combat tour in Iraq during the surge in 2007. But we have to get there, and I have to explain all the pieces and parts that got us into going there. And I'll do this a little out of time order because, I didn't memorize the dates. People that listen aren't going to memorize the dates. I mean, who cares? That's what we hated about history class. Saying that as a guy with an advanced history degree is who wants to memorize dates? Nobody. So I may do this a little bit out of order, but you'll get the flow, and we'll all end up to where I am today, wearing an attractive shirt with a Strike Eagle t-shirt that Steve completely dissed before we started the recording. Okay, so that's where I am. I'm in the skunkworks. I'm actually there assigned to the Pentagon on September 11th. And although I'm not at the building, so I was away at Pax River Naval Air Station, which is about 90 minutes away in the base theater when the building was hit. I ended up coming back to the building after I went home, a lot of chaos. And I've done disaster relief before. So I grabbed a helmet bag, my Nokia cell phone. I actually had a cell phone in 2000. That stuff was amazing, but it wasn't like the marvelous, iPhone that I have today that you can't see because my background suppresses it. And a book and some granola bars and some water, and I headed back to the building because I knew there was always something undone. And, talked my way through the cordon, checked in with the incident commander, and he, of course, didn't know that stuff was undone because the incident commander never knows that stuff is not being done because that's why it's not being done, because it's fallen through the cracks. And I end up meeting with Mike Moore, who's a classmate of mine from Penn State. He has set up a triage center underneath an overpass on Washington Boulevard because it was sheltered with good overhead cover, and we weren't sure if a second attack was coming. And he's had this well in hand for hours because I don't arrive at the Pentagon till probably afternoon. And I say, what do you need? He says, when night comes, I need a 24-hour helicopter pad because the aircraft, when it hit the Pentagon has its own helicopter pad and control tower and fire truck. But the left wing of the airliner hit the fire truck and disabled it, which is why we had nothing on site that could handle an aviation fuel fire. The fire caused, quite legitimately, the crew in the control tower, the Pentagon control tower, to leave the control tower, which is all scorched on one side. So we have no control over our own landing pad, and the landing pad's covered in wreckage. And the helicopters had been using a cloverleaf in Washington overpass because that's where Mike's triage center was. So I said, fine. And I said, I'll work on it. And I wandered off to the Navy Annex. Now, the Navy Annex is on the other side of Washington Boulevard. It's long gone, since been demolished. but it was a bunch of World War II overflow buildings that I went to because they weren't on fire. And I figured maybe I can find some command and control element. Not only do I find one, I find the Marines have set up a C2 element because they're Marines, and of course they have. And I end up being the Marine Air Officer for a couple of hours because they had no other aviators. And so I showed up, asking what they could do to help me, and it's suddenly what I can do to help them. So they're waiting for it. And I say, you Marines have helicopters. I don't know anything about helicopters. It's like, yeah, well, you know more than the rest of us. So I'm the Marine Air Officer for a couple of hours. So I'm watching the flow. I'm watching commands go back and forth. I'm watching Joint Forces Command completely collapse in this mired pool of indecision. I watch the Air Force dispatch an air transportable hospital without any direction from Joint Forces Command because SHIFCOM isn't giving it. I watched the Navy roll an amphibious ready group out of Norfolk. I mean, this is all happening within hours, but not commanded by Joint Forces Command. We watch a Special Operations Task Force start heading up to New York with the heavy lift helicopters. They actually operated off the Carrier Museum Essex in New York Harbor. And so all this was happening on the day in an environment where the command organization, which was supposed to be Joint Forces Command to handle North America, had completely collapsed, which is one of the reasons why they eventually went away and were replaced with Northcom. So anyway, I'm watching this, and my reward when we finally get a Marine Air Officer is they give me a fire team, 4 Marines, to go solve my helicopter pad problem. And I have a telephone. I call a nearby Air Force base. I get in touch with the engineers, and they say they're going to send up over a flatbed of Lidalls. So, going this back and forth, we talk to the helicopter pilots. We do a survey of the area. Me and my 4 Marines coming around, and we do not have an excuse to knock over the light poles. Okay, there are light poles on the cloverleaf, but those are a good place for the helicopter. And the helicopter pilots say, well, they're lit, so they're easy to avoid, and we can see them at night because they're lights. So I have no excuse to bulldozer these suckers over and clear a helicopter pad, which is kind of a bummer, but we've got heavy equipment coming. Heavy equipment arrives on a flatbed, no forklift. And the Lidalls are heavy. So now I've got 4 Marines, myself, 3 engineers, and it's like, okay, what do we do now? Well, in the meantime, this is late afternoon, so it's about 4 or 5 o'clock. People had converged on the Pentagon. So the American Red Cross had shown up with a bunch of little old ladies in golf carts, and they were distributing sandwiches, driving around the whole disaster site. There is an equipment rental company called like Suncorp. It's a green background with a yellow sun on it. They had showed up with a bunch of heavy equipment, earth movers, forklift, and so on, and just left them in the parking lot with the keys in the ignition.
Wow.
FEMA had showed up, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They showed up. They set up tents. The Men and Women Baptists Club of North Carolina has a mobile food kitchen. And when they saw the news, they packed up, drove up from North Carolina, set up in Pentagon South parking, and had a hot food kitchen running before sunset. McDonald's has disaster relief. They have trucks that show up with a limited menu. It's a portable kitchen, and of course, a golden M on an extendable pole. So in South parking for weeks after the event, you had a McDonald's emergency kitchen where they had erected their M on a stick and were supplying people in and out of the Pentagon, emergency workers, Pentagon workers once we reopened the building. So all this stuff is going on, and I need a forklift. And I walk up to this collection of heavy equipment that I have no idea what to do with. And I look inside, and there's keys. And I go to the FEMA guy next, and I said, is this your forklift? And he goes, no. And he said, and I said, I need one though. He goes, well, you know what I'd do? And I said, yeah. And I'm fixing to do just that, which means, unfortunately, there's 2 things. One, I just used fixing in a sentence when I'm not talking about repairing my car. So that's totally Southern, and I'm not totally Southern. So I'm embarrassed that I actually ever said that. So why I'm saying it on a podcast, I don't know. And then I realize I'm about to commit my first felony, grand theft forklift. So I go back to my engineers and I say, can anybody drive a forklift? One of them says, I can drive a forklift. And I do not ask to see his forklift license. That's good enough for me. You can drive a forklift. So he gets the forklift. We unload the light alls, and we only dropped one of them. Perfectly understandable. Lifted it from the wrong lift point, and it still worked afterwards. And nobody ever billed me for it, so that wasn't a problem. And we set up light alls around the clover leaves, and we now had a 24-hour chopper pad. In the meantime, with my fading cell phone battery, I had called Reagan National Airport, and they had agreed to assume control over Pentagon airspace, which is under their wedding cake anyway. So we now had air traffic control. We had a 24-hour helicopter pad. We had everything going. We set it up, and a little old lady from the Red Cross in a a golf cart comes along and feeds me a bunch of chicken salad sandwiches at 2:00 in the morning because she insists that I eat. Because clearly that's the advantage of having your grandmother show up at a disaster site is everybody eats whether they want to or not. And there we go. So that was my September 11th experience is, we put the forklift back. Forklift was undamaged. The gas tank was a little low, but everything went back where it was supposed to go. We operated the lights for the next 3 days. I would go in to make sure they were turned on at nightfall and turned off at sunrise. And we had a helicopter pad because at that point, while we had gotten everybody we were going to get out of the Pentagon, we didn't know that. And we still had firefighters in the Pentagon. So anybody that we got out of the building at that point was going to need a helicopter medevac. So we had our pad. And, I finished it up and went back to work whenever we went back to work. And Scotty Long, one of my mates in the skunk, F-16 driver, short, little hyperactive Viper dude, really excellent human being, later became a wing commander. And selected for a star, by the way, but elected to retire first. Anyway, he put me in for a medal, which was nice of him. So September 11th, yeah, I spent a lot of time waiting around, running down my cell phone battery in the company of a Marine fire team and some Air Force engineers, all to build a helicopter pad.
That's a cool story.
But I digress.
That's a cool story. I love that.
So, we go into what happens after September 11th is I have managed to achieve my goals as I keep getting new sets of orders. So I'm on orders in the skunkworks at 6-month chunks. Every 6 months, I get a new set of orders because they'll only cut them for 6 months. But I'm rolling mine over. And after September 11th, I actually get recalled, a limited period recall for 2 years. So I'm essentially back on active duty. But with a 2-year recall, you stay in the reserve personnel system. You don't, with a 3 or 4 year recall, you move back into the active duty personnel system and you compete terribly. So, in the meantime, I had been passed over for major with a definitely promote at Lakenheath because I had a separation date. But I accidentally got promoted to major in the Guard because 6 weeks
how
after
does that happen?
So it's weird. So, and I don't know any of this is happening, so 6 weeks after I signed in with the Guard, I met a promotion board. That's not supposed to happen. It's supposed to be 6 months. But because my records hadn't transferred, all that meets the promotion board is my name and social security number. No records. So I get passed over for promotion to major again, having had no idea this has happened. And the only clue I get on this is I get a letter addressed to Captain Pietrucha, informing me I've been passed over for a promotion to captain. Now, at this point, I've been a captain for 8 years. So I sensed that something was wrong with this whole process. And so I call back and I say, what's with the letter? And they said, yeah, you met with a promotion board, but your record wasn't there. And so they passed you over. And I go, great, I want a supplemental. Because if the Air Force screws up the promotion board, they can't take it back. So the fact that I was ineligible for this board was irrelevant. I met the board and my records weren't there, but it was not my fault. It was their fault. So I get a supplemental, which is a do-over.
Okay.
And they put your boards in front of a do-over panel and they try and decide whether or not they would have promoted you at the time. Well, it turns out the Board for Correction of Military Records, which is a military bureaucracy that in my experience works like a champ every time I've used them. And I have one more because I need to catch up on all the ribbons I didn't care about while I was on active duty, but I have to have the right ribbon rack on my corpse when I'm buried. So I need to go back to the board and actually correct all my ribbons and medals and stuff, but that'll happen later. Anyway, they decide that I would be promoted to major. And so I get promoted to major and they tell me you've been selected for major. And I say, great. And I'm waiting for a line number to come down because you get notified of your promotion and then you get a line number and it occurs some number of months later. And I get no information and I finally call them back and say, hey, you haven't told me what the line number is. And they say, oh, no, you were promoted to major the day we told you were promoted to major. So the effect of all this is that I get promoted to major in the Guard accidentally and pin it on earlier than I would have if I'd been promoted on time on active duty. So I'm passed over for early to major. I mean, it's weird. So kind of, pinning on major, I'm now recalled. And we start invading Iraq. Okay, first Afghanistan, then Iraq.
Stop it. Let me stop you in mid-flow. Sorry. Can you just quickly describe what's happening to your EWO knowledge during this period where you're not being an EWO? So are you doing EWO stuff in the skunkworks at the Pentagon? Did you do EWO stuff for the DC Guard? What's happening to that knowledge?
Right. So I was the wing EWO while I was in the DC Guard. So that's keeping that a little warm. I'm still doing electronic warfare stuff on the side in the Pentagon. What's actually keeping me warm is participation at Nellis Air Force Base. So at the time, and I'm glad you asked the question because I would have forgotten. So my EWO knowledge is definitely getting stale. Okay, but the book knowledge is not bad because I actually have access to more intelligence than I ever had in the field. That's one thing guys in the field don't realize. They think they're getting the good information flow because it's, they've got their manuals. There are other sources of information that you get when you're on the staff. Some of it is genuinely scary. And so I'm keeping my book knowledge current, but my operational knowledge is fading. So is everybody else's. By this time, the Air Force has dumped their EW knowledge, and the guys that are keeping it are the guys that get involuntarily sent to prowlers, which is most of them, the B-52 EWOs, and of course the rivet joint compass call guys. So those guys are all keeping current with air, but the Air Force Enterprise has been flushed down the toilet. So I'm atrophying. Where I'm keeping some degree of operational knowledge is I'm actually an instructor at KOC-N at Nellis. So Nellis set up a combined air operations center, now combined air and space operations center. And I was out there for the last green flag, the last electronic warfare flag. I actually have pieces of the green flag because after the last one, they cut up the flag. So I have my little, it was a green flag in the red flag building. So they cut it up and I have a piece of the green flag. And I end up with a bunch of AWACS guys as they all instructors, mostly weapons school graduates, really sharp folks, and they're setting up KOC-N. So they can teach kind of people how to run an ops floor in conjunction with red flag. And they asked me, hey, do you want to be involved as the initial cadre, an instructor? And I said, absolutely not. And the next thing I know, I'm an instructor at KOC-N. And so while I'm at the skunkworks, I'm actually traveling back to Nellis regularly during exercises because I will run the combat ops floor and I will teach people how to do time-sensitive targeting, how to work the thought process, how to do as many things as you possibly can and work up to the next stop and know why you're stopped and what information you're looking for that will allow you to move beyond that stop. And that is the time frame when we developed the time-sensitive targeting procedures that are used after Allied force. Where we had investigate, target, smack, different taskings, because we took those from air to air because they're all AWACS guys with a fighter guy. So we would initially say, hey, we want you to go VID the target. That's where we suspect we have one, but we need the fighter to go VID. Well, that became investigate. And then, target would be, go check out the target. If it meets your ID criteria, you can kill it. So that became target. And then destroy was KAOC buys the bomb. All these techniques were developed out of things we'd done in 1999 and at Allied Force and things we should have done better. So that that we refined those as we went into Iraq and Afghanistan. But that's where those procedures started out. And we stole from air to air to do time-sensitive targeting because the air-to-air fight is a time-sensitive fight. So it got me to go back out to Nellis. It got me participating in red flags. I'd do the debrief. And I remember one time we authorized a JDAM drop against a target that was not approved for JDAM. Okay, and I'm the director of the combat ops floor, so I get to do my all-time favorite thing, which is go in front of the big debrief at Red Flag in front of my friends and peers, because there's a bunch of Strike Eagle guys there from Lakenheath, and admit that we completely screwed the pooch sideways. And so, yeah, I mean, that's definitely a learning experience, but that was kind of slowing down my loss of currency because I still saw tactics that guys were executing. I still had the book knowledge. So when you're on the staff, you lose your situational awareness and you don't even know that you've lost it. And I knew I was losing it and I could slow down the loss, but eventually you become a cubicle denizen with no actual real clue. And the Pentagon sucks you into this morass of non-reality in which your daily production is measured by whether or not you can go home early and how many slides you produced. And the Air Force, I mean, they were crazy about PowerPoint slides. We had a 3-star at the time, who later became a USAFE commander. I won't mention his name because it'll cost me money. Somebody will find me for it, but we referred to him as Satan for entirely good reasons. I mean, the guy was, pardon?
Can I say his name?
You could.
Is it Fogelman?
It's not Fogelman.
Fogel,
You're
sorry.
half right. Could be. I will neither confirm nor deny. Okay. But man, what a piece of work. And so working for Satan was a big nightmare. I mean, there's plenty of senior officers who have I love me walls. I have an I love me wall. It's currently packed up in a box because I had to move out of my office, but it's normal. I'd never seen anybody where they convert the annex, which is a high ceiling annex to their office in the Pentagon, to an I love me room, a whole freaking room where you make your visitors wait while they're waiting for an appointment so you can read all this I love me stuff. Wow. Anyway, the guy was genuinely evil. I mean, one of the definitions of toxic leadership. And he issued a PowerPoint slide that told you the exact hue and color that all your fonts had to be to match the Air Force thing. This was the template, the original template, unbelievably anal. And that's, how we get into the Pentagon. So we go through, we're watching checkmate assists, and the skunks kind of help augment checkmate for operations in Afghanistan. That was kind of funny because guys going in Afghanistan, we play the handbook. This is our campaign planning handbook. You've got to hit fuel stocks. Where are the fuel stocks in Afghanistan? I remember being in a meeting and saying, people commuting into and out of the Pentagon every day use more gasoline than the entire daily consumption of the country of Afghanistan. Oh. That's not a lie. Wow. That's accurate. People commuting to the Pentagon use more liquid fuels than Afghanistan did the whole country for a day in 2001. So, we're trying to put some reality on it. We got to bomb the airfields. Well, okay, but they don't have any airplanes. So the playbook is a little bit different. Now, the initial operation went pretty well. And then we shift into Iraq. There was no reason to go into Iraq. There was an absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. We know now that there was bad intelligence, but there was also a lot of pushing in the U.S. Department of Defense to go into Iraq, particularly from the U.S. Army staff, because we had just won a war with air power and Allied force, although that was a pretty ugly win. And now we needed a ground war. Got to have a ground war. And Afghanistan wasn't big enough. You couldn't use tanks in Afghanistan. So now we got to get tanks into the game. And people will say, no, the Army wasn't jonesing for a battle in Iraq, but I was there, and the Army staff was jonesing for a battle in Iraq.
Hey everybody, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but if you'd like to support the channel, please do visit 10percenttrue.com and take a look at my store. You can buy polo shirts, t-shirts, stickers, patches, and even my books. And speaking of which, if you're listening to the podcast, this won't make sense, but if you're watching it, then great. The one that's being played in the background at the moment is my new book, F-15E Strike Eagle, Be Afraid of the Dark, Part 1. It's a glorious coffee table book, been professionally laid out and put together. Tells the story of the Strike Eagle from 1984 to 2002. I'm taking pre-orders for it now. If you're interested in it, if you're thinking that might make a nice present for somebody, please do go ahead, visit 10percenttrue.com, place an order. Thank you.
Have you seen... it's a little bit of a tangent, but it is relative to this. Have you seen the interview clip? I think it was with General Wesley Clark, where he talks about the Bush administration giving him a list of 6, or he goes to the Pentagon, and one of his, sort of one of the generals, 2 3-star generals who used to work for him, I think, comes up to him and said, "Have you seen this list? This is a list of 6 countries we're going to invade." Have you seen that clip of Wesley Clark saying that?
I've heard about it. I haven't seen
any
it.
evidence of that. Then could the
not in planning, okay. not in any planning that I was exposed to. Okay. There is a list of countries that, so you could easily conflate that with a list of standing war plans, just like we had prior to the Second World War. So you can look up War Plan Orange, War Plan Red. I mean, these were War Plan Orange was the Pacific, War Plan Yellow. These were all war plans where we had to invade people. And the people on the list to be invaded included Canada. We have invaded Canada before, and you can actually buy a t-shirt today in the US that says Invade Canada. I mean, look it up. Really? It's like invadecanada.com. Absolutely. But the fact is that I don't think we really want Canada. And the last time we invaded Canada, it didn't go so well. When I was in Canada at the Strike University in Halifax, because we were doing some electronic warfare, some joint electronic warfare with the Canadians, it was great visiting the fort in Halifax because this was a fort designed to keep the Americans at bay. And I'm not normally used to visiting fortifications that are designed to keep the Americans at bay. So that was kind of different. Anyway, we had a plan to invade Canada as late as the 1930s. That doesn't mean we're actually going to invade Canada, but it is a viable exercise plan. It is something to put on the back burner. And we have plans like that all the time. So I have no doubt that there was a list of plans of at least 6 countries that might involve an invasion. I saw no evidence whatsoever that there was any kind of planning to actually execute that.
All right.
So I'm not a big fan of General Clark. So where was I? Oh, okay. So
the Army were sort of spoiling for their fight in Iraq.
Right. The Army spoiling, they get their fight in Iraq, and it bogs down pretty quickly. And so we end up very early with an explosive threat. The IEDs, the improvised explosive device. The press calls them roadside bombs. And they are taking a fairly nasty toll. In the meantime, I had negotiated a return to the Strike Eagle. General Matthews had become the wing commander. He put in a by-name request for me to go back to Lakenheath to fill his strike shop, and the Personnel Center had agreed to it. And then they backed off. And on a call at which we had, General Keyes was the director of operations, 3-star, and his chief of staff was on the phone call, and the Personnel Center guys said, basically, we are not honoring any commitments made to you or to your commander on your return to a Strike Eagle. I was later told, I don't know whether or not it's true, there was a yellow sticky note in my personnel file down in San Antonio that because I had dodged the Prowler, they would not let me back into a Strike Eagle. Oh. So they said on a telecon, we will not honor any commitments made, and I did not make it back into a Strike Eagle, so I now have to find a way to get back into the fight. because I just don't like sitting on the staff while somebody else is doing the fighting, so I ended up with this airplane behind me, horned owl. And let me bring up God help me, I'm a former staff officer, so I'm going to bring up a slide, and then I promise the rest are just going to be pictures. All right, so this is the data we were operating from, by the time, and you can see by the time 2003 up to 2007, we were seeing an increasing toll. And I entered this at about the middle, okay, and then re-entered it, at 2007. So we've got a couple parallel things going on. But the first is this bird. This is horned owl. And you can't see because I'm standing in front of it, but my background will have it. This is the Dynamic Aviation facility in Virginia. And Dynamic Aviation is a pretty good aviation company that specifies in rapid modification of all variants of King Air. And what they had done is they had put a synthetic aperture radar on this airplane. And you can see it's in its combat configuration because you see the 2 missile warning sensors on the nose. Mm-hmm. It's got missile warning on the tail. It has flares. And I'm obscuring the canoe. I'm going to stop sharing. But let's move off to the side one way or another, this way.
Oh, yeah.
That's the canoe underneath. And what is underneath here is a synthetic aperture radar that works in 3D. And so the chief of staff of the Air Force at the time, Secretary Roche, we called him Pooh Bear behind his back because he was just so much of a Winnie the Pooh. He's a retired naval officer. And he sets up a little shop that will do rapid projects. And he wanted to hunt IEDs with synthetic aperture radar. And a lot of them were being made out of 122 millimeter artillery shells. That was a big deal. And so what you do with volumetric SAR is you make multiple passes on a target, and it assembles a color picture in 3 dimensions. This stuff was awesome. And I got myself on the deployment list to be the ops officer for Horned Owl. I was going to go back in. I was going to go back into Iraq. I was going to start racking up some sorties. This was going to be awesome because what you can't see is it's also got a FLIR ball behind the radar. So you actually have a sensor kit. And, really, I can't say enough about this kind of operational test in a combat theater. But the synthetic aperture radar was great, but it was not good for finding IEDs because there was too much clutter. So there's just too much trash and too much metal. And I'll talk more about that as we get on, and I have a ground point of view on it. But you could see the IEDs, but you see everything else, and there's too much. So it's when people talk about sensor capabilities, you need to think about clutter. So a radar, if you're looking up, to find an airplane, there's no clutter. Hey, it's just the atmosphere, an airplane, and the next thing along the way is the moon, if it happens to be aligned. If you're looking down with a radar, all those ground objects are clutter. Okay, that's why look down, shoot down was such a challenge. Not because the sensor couldn't see the airplane. It could see the airplane. It just saw everything else, and you couldn't break the airplane out. That was the problem with the F4's radar. And you see that in the earlier episodes when I show you the F4 radar tape, and there's all this goo on the screen. So that was the problem with this. But what you could do with volumetric SAR is you could task the aircraft to look at things where maybe they were storing shells in a building. So they got the experience where they could fly by the building, and they'd fly by it 3 times. They'd do a 3D image. They could tell bed springs from 122 millimeter artillery shells, from filing cabinets, and so on.
So it would penetrate the walls and the ceiling?
Penetrate the walls.
Wow.
Yep. Because a lot of construction in Iraq is unreinforced concrete. Penetrates the walls just fine. And then in cases where you had buried weapons caches, and they were tasked against 7 of them, and they confirmed all 7. They went 7 for 7. And so I'm slated to be the next deployment OPSO. The deployment is going to come back. They're going to do a quick upgrade, a hardware upgrade that they can't do in theater, and they're going to send it back. But the Pentagon intervenes. So there is a new 3-star who's moved to another 3-star job. He's going to be a commander in AF South. Davis Monthan. And I don't know whether he even knew about this, but he wanted Horned Owl down to support Colombian operations because that same frequency of SAR can penetrate jungle foliage. So it's an obvious application to look for drug labs and FARC insurgents in the jungle where other radars cannot penetrate. And so the problem is there's no money for that. So there's a bunch of minions in the Pentagon who are trying to divert this airframe. So first they pull it out of CENTCOM without telling the four-star General Abizaid. And he gets wind of it when the aircraft is in Turkey on its way back. And they say, no, we're just bringing it back for a hardware fix. And we'll send it back when the hardware fix is done. That wasn't the air staff intention. The pocket of the air staff now controlling this was going to steal this airplane and send it to Southcom after the modification. And so they lied to General Abizaid. They brought it back. And as soon as it touched U.S. soil and was not going back to CENTCOM, all the funding stream went away because somebody else saw there's no funding stream for it. There is no funding for Southcom. Southcom is called the Economy of Force Command because they never get any money or assets, and they don't own any assets other than headquarters buildings. And so the aircraft essentially goes away because once you coded it differently to go to a different theater, the money went away. Once the money went away, there was no money to send it back, and it disappeared.
Wow.
The aircraft was demodified, and we lost the capability. So I'm pissed. You had a question.
Yeah.
Spit it out.
So how was this guy at Davis Monthan proposing then to take the Horned Owl and fly it over Colombia or wherever it was he wanted to fly it over? If the money was going to go away.
Well, so that was an unanticipated effect. It was not part of the plan. It's different people. And remember, I don't know if the 3-star knew anything about this. He almost certainly asked for the aircraft. Whether or not he knew about the staff machinations going on in the background, I have no idea. To be fair. So, so the plan was, and the way the plan was briefed is that we would divert to Southcom. And instead of deploying to Baghdad, I would deploy to hopefully Curacao. And I would have been happy flying missions over Colombia in the jungle, out of a Dutch resort island. I'd have been cool with that. But the background funding, as with so many things in the Pentagon, that's what screwed it up. Once because Southcom had no monetary assets to put against it, they couldn't send it down and they couldn't keep the deployment going. So I ended up on orders for 2.5 days and then coming off orders because the whole deployment was canceled. It was like a stop in the middle of it.
Can I ask
so that was kind of...
Let me ask you another question then. So, well, 2 questions really rolled into one. But so first of all, with Afghanistan and Iraq being the focal point of U.S. foreign policy at that point in time, it was all over the news, all over the world, every day. IED totals. You've just shown us the slide to show how they sort of ebbed and flowed and so on and got worse over time. How did somebody justify morally taking those aeroplanes then and sending them to go and interdict or look for drug, as you say, FARC, drug little factories in the forests of Colombia or whatever? And then the second part to the question is, how do you take an asset away from a 4-star general? Who does that? Who does it take another 4-star general to say, yeah, you can pull those out and then we'll hatch a plan? Can a 3-star general do it? Does a colonel do it? How does that even happen? How do you sneak that from underneath the 4-star general's nose?
You just tell them to fly out and you give them a flight plan.
Really?
Yeah. So it was that easy. They snuck it out under his nose and he caught wind of it and then they lied to him. You use the word morals in the context of the Pentagon. You don't seem to understand. There are no morals in the Pentagon. There are merely objectives. Right. And so one of the things, and I'll talk more about Colombia because I went down there in 2007. That's how we're kick off my irregular warfare career, which is really this episode is more about the irregular warfare years than about anything else. It'll end up with the light attack experiment. So Colombia was a success. Colombia was a wild success at building a counterinsurgency operation. And the drug flow is a national security related threat. So, I mean, there was good justification to send an airplane down, but when you have a one of a kind asset, it's questionable whether or not that was the highest priority. But it was the highest priority for some people in the Pentagon. And so the fact that you could easily have said, well, CENTCOM commander has plenty of assets and Southcom commander has none. AF South commander has none. You know, they won't miss Horned Owl. So all those come into play. And remember, Horned Owl was not successful at finding IEDs. It was successful in other missions. But if you were to say we sent it in to find IEDs and it couldn't do that, you could well have said it was a failure and we're looking for other missions to do it. I've spent so much time on the staff, I can spin this any way you want and put it in a PowerPoint slide and send it to a general officer. And everything I said will be true and my motives will be hidden. And that's the way the building works. So that's how it left and it went away. And I'm pissed because not only have we lost an asset that I think is stellar, but I lost a deployment. You know, I was looking forward to getting over 200 combat missions, and this was yanked out from underneath me, which annoyed the hell out of me. So I come to the realization that the Air Force is not putting its best foot forward in terms of reconnaissance and surveillance operations for the war that we're actually in by the 2004 timeframe in Iraq. And I start a series of briefs that were called Beyond Predator, because at that time, Predator and ISR had become the same thing. Mm-hmm. And there was this weird operationalization of intel in that General Deptula gets promoted to 3 stars and he gets put in charge of A2, the intel in the Pentagon. He's there for 3 or 4 years, which is a long time. And they're trying to fix intel. But one of the ways that one of the rabbit trails they went down was to operationalize it as if intel weren't a support function, as if it were a function that needed to be supported. So you ended up with an intel Air Force, and the Air Force locked in on drones. Okay, drones were it. We had done away with the RF-4Cs after the Gulf War. So there was strategic intel, but tactical reconnaissance, we didn't have any good tactical recon. Until over Bosnia, we got the Predator. And then Snake Clark was brought in to put Hellfires on the Predator. And the Predator was the thing. We were going to do unmanned reconnaissance forever with these sensor balls and with their radars and their ELINT packages, but you're still, you know, flying an unmanned aircraft around looking at a soda straw, and it wasn't doing any better at finding IEDs than anything else was. And so what we had in Horned Owl was we had a multi-int asset. It had a FLIR ball, it had a radar, and we needed to expand on that. So I started a series of briefs called Beyond Predator that later became Thinking Small, and I started looking at aircraft that could do flexible recon because I needed more space and power and lift capability than the MQ-1 was going to give me, or when the MQ-9 came online, then it was going to give. So I looked at the Lear 35 because there are plenty of people that use Lear jets for reconnaissance. The obvious choice was the MC-12, although it wasn't called that. It was the Beechcraft King Air 200. The Army had been using them for reconnaissance for years. There's also various versions of the de Havilland Dash 8. There were possibilities. I went through all this. I was doing a one-man analysis of alternatives in the Skunks. And I got this up to the staff, and then it was shit-canned. And it became... I got pretty much a thank you for your interest in national defense. And that was it. I was done with the Skunks. I was through. And I ended up saying, where can I get a job? Okay, where can I go and do something else? And I ended up going back and forth between Nellis and Langley. And it's because my boss, Mike Warden, General Warden, who wrote, I think, The Rise of the Fighter Generals, and a classic text on what's wrong with Air Force leadership. And he brings me with him, and we end up going a couple places to Air Combat Command, but first we go to the Irregular Warfare Center at Nellis. Now, I want the MC-12 to be a thing, but I'm calling it RCX. And at this time, we have two threads emerge. One is the OAX, which is a modern look at the A1 Skyraider, reimagined, with a new airframe, and the other is RCX. And the short version on the RCX portion is that the Air Force and Navy all had to pay a tax into the ISR task force in the Pentagon. And I was loaned to the ISR task force in the Pentagon, and all they wanted was UAVs. So I put up a proposal, to use the RC-12, modified RC-12, like Horned Owl. We use the Beech 200. And I was talking to the special projects guys at, it was then Hawker Beechcraft, before Hawker went away completely. And they said, yeah, we can do it. And I researched the data and I put this package together. The Air Force was not interested. I had a brief, I explained it, and the Air Force prioritized it out of the top 10. But a loner on the staff, call sign Badger, I don't even know who the guy's name really is, who had come up from Special Operations headquarters in Tampa, did not know how the Pentagon worked, took one of my briefs and hands it to the guys at the Office of the Secretary of Defense who were running the ISR task force. Completely independent of the Air Force prioritization, which would have shuffled it off into a closet. And the task force says, perfect, we'll take 50. And we'll give half to the Air Force and half to the Army, and we'll pay for them. Now, it's really the services have been taxed. There's no money in the ISR task force, so all the services get taxed. That pool of money goes in the ISR task force, then it flows back. So the Air Force is essentially paying, and the Army, they're paying for something they don't want. So 50 aircraft, because at the time, we had a requirement for 50 CAPs, 50 combat air patrols doing ISR over Iraq. But the people making the decisions didn't understand that in order to man a 24-hour CAPS, you need several aircraft. So they said 50 CAPs, 50 airplanes. We'll give you 50 airplanes. And the Army comes back and says, we can only man 13 airplanes. And the Air Force says, yeah, okay. And so the ISR task force says, okay, Army gets 13 airplanes. The Air Force gets 37. Because that's 50 minus 13. So if you wondered, anybody wonders why we got 37 MC-12s, it's because it's 50 minus 13. And that's how that happened. I get fired. This is the first time I get fired. I walk in to the ISR task force. Major General Blair Hansen had been running it. He's a 2-star Strike Eagle guy. And he looks at me, and this has been my assigned duty station for a while in the Pentagon. And he says, can I help you? In that tone of voice that pretty much says, get the fuck out of this office. So I have my brief handed over to OSD, not by me. It is wildly successful. We get money for 37 airplanes thrown at us, and I'm fired for it. And we had to send Colonel Wright up to take my place at the ISR task force from where I was at Langley. And I'm done. I got to find something else to do. I go back to doing stuff from command headquarters and not from the ISR task force. And, there was a big disagreement because the Air Force wanted to man this rotationally. They just wanted people to go in for 6 months. I wanted a permanent structure. And I said, it's a safety problem. And if you man it rotationally, you're going to lose aircraft due to crew inexperience. That's exactly what happened. And I'm still salty about that. And another one of my classmates was involved in this process, although the classmate in question didn't make any decisions. But we really haven't spoken since the split, when the Intel guys who are now running their own Air Force decide they're going to man this rotationally at 6 months. So nobody who flies the airplane will ever get more than 6 months experience in it unless they do multiple tours. You should never do that. That's insane. And I pointed it out, and it's one of those cases where I hated to be right.
So let me just ask you to expand on that a little bit. So I know there was an MC-12 that went out of control in bad weather. Was an airplane lost as well? Was one crashed, or?
Yeah, so there was an airplane mishap where the airplane crashed on approach, I believe, in Djibouti. can find the mishap report. 4 fatalities on board. Crew inexperience, a key issue.
Wow.
There were also some cowboy issues where several of the aircraft were over-G'd because the air crews were playing games with them over Afghanistan and exceeding the parameters of the flight manual because there was no inadequate supervision. That was kind of effectively buried because it didn't result in any Class A's. And what I wanted for the MC-12 was a multi-mission capable aircraft where, with some help from some talented engineers, we had designed a payload bay that would go along the bottom where you would just upload your payload with the radar. And, the only permanent part of the installation would be the ball. And I wanted the ball to be controlled from the right front seat so that the front seat could do forward air control. So that you could do FAC. Because the co-pilot / Wizzo would be running it because the MC-12 or the C-12, which is, again, a Beech King Air, it's 1 pilot certified, even though it has 2 pilot flight deck. So we could have done Pilot Wizzo, could have done FAC in addition to ISR. This gets handed over to Big Safari. Big Safari is a special organization that's existed since the Vietnam War, really, to do special things quickly, focused on ISR at the time. And they promised me, when I handed it over, they said, we will not build you into a corner. And I said, okay. The bastards built me into a corner. In that they didn't go with a reconfigurable payload bay. They went with a fixed sensor array. And so we lost the flexibility that I wanted for the MC-12, but we still put assets in the air. They also moved the ball controls so that you had an ISR ball operator, an Intel guy in the back. This is an artifact of having Intel in charge of their own Air Force at the time. So we lost the FAC-A mission, which is what the MC-12 could have been doing. I actually had pictures of the MC-12 photoshopped with Hellfires under the wing. Done the engineering work with Hawker Beechcraft, could have been done, was not done. So my vision for the RCX, later MCX, was only partially envisioned. But I count this as a success in that I'm claiming I'm the guy that was behind it, okay? Because I am the guy that was behind it. And that was a new airplane that went into U.S. Air Force service. Not everything I wanted it to be. The name, the Liberty, came from Hondo Gertz, who was one of those legendary SOCOM guys who made his mark really getting things done well and quickly on the acquisition front. And he was part of the Liberty project, but really all that he brought to it in terms of the concept, he brought something to it in terms of execution. In terms of the concept was the name. That's how Liberty came about. Is because his idea for Liberty was to rapidly build cheap aircraft like we had built Liberty ships in the Second World War. Crank them out quickly. So what Big Safari did is instead of using a King Air 200, which would have been overweighted, which it was allowed to do, but it still would have been very much a pig, they went with a King Air 350, which is still a pig once you weight it down, but had more power and more space and more endurance. So we ended up with a more expensive aircraft. And so there were a couple that were bought from like Doctors, King Air 300s, and modified. I think those were the first 7, but the remaining 30 were new build King Air 350s. So we got a good, really solid airframe. What Sierra Nevada later did for Customs and Border Patrol is they built the RCX I wanted.
Oh, did they?
They call it the Multi-Mission Enforcement Aircraft, and it is a King Air 350 that has a reconfigurable top and bottom. The bottom is called the hot tub, and it can hold things from radar to other things. It's just this big black radome-looking thing, sensor ball. And then on the top, they have what they call the surfboard, which allows you to change all your communications antennas without drilling holes in the airplane.
That's cool.
You just rebuild the surfboard with the antennas you want. Okay. You attach it to the top where it plugs into the ports are already there for connecting the coax cables and whatnot. And the structural mount is there. So the Customs and Border Patrol flies the multi-mission enforcement aircraft, which is what I wanted the RCX, the MCX to be. Okay. They got the airplane but they got it much later. And I only found it accidentally while I was visiting a Sierra Nevada facility to see, and they showed it off, and I'm going, holy shit, this is the airplane I wanted. This is amazing. So Sierra Nevada did it for another portion of the federal government years later. So it could have been done right, but it was done quickly instead. It still got capability in, and that's how the MC-12 came about.
Let me ask
And
you. Let me ask you then a
yeah,
couple of questions about MC-12. Then, so going right back to the beginning of the requirements for the RC-12, or one of the drivers for it was IED hunting. You said it wasn't great at finding it in clutter, but you could go and find a building full of it, and it would differentiate a 120mm mortar shell from a bed spring. How did MC-12 handle that mission? How was MC-12 no SAR radar? How was it going to go out and help with the IED problem, or was it not designed to do that?
it was not really designed to do that. It was designed to not so much hunt IEDs as hunt the network that put the IEDs in place. It's a legitimate approach. You're trying to get left of boom. But by not having the reconfigurable sensor array, we passed up opportunities to mission configure them with a bunch of additional sensors. So it was years before we put radars back in the game. And we missed the opportunity to put really fancy optical sensors like Angel Fire or Constant Hawk, which were the first multi-megapixel sensors designed to do forensic work.
Tell us about those. How good are they? What does forensic work mean?
So it meant that, so with Angel Fire, Constant Hawk, what you did is, and this was invented at MIT. I think Dr. Bill Ross is behind it. And what he took is he took a bunch of commercial camera arrays, which had X number of megapixels, and he stitched them together digitally so they don't have any seams.
Oh, no.
Okay? And you put this behind a camera array and you fly it, and you're collecting this massive multi-square mile square at one shot at high resolution. And you take a shot every half second. And one of the things this was used for forensically was if a vehicle exploded and you had an aircraft airborne, you had collected the data on where that came from. And so you could track back the vehicle forensically. Now, there were challenges, but the computer would assist you with tracking, and it would do that in near real time or forensically. The problem in Iraq, the challenge is when every car is white colored with dust, the optical tracker has a little problem. And of course, every threat vehicle is a white Toyota pickup truck or a white Toyota sedan, because if you buy a black car in Iraq, you're pretty much a freaking moron, or you're immune to heat stress, right? So, yeah. So, but we couldn't put those in MC-12, so they ended up going in a rented King Air 200. That was Angel Fire. That's what the Marines took into service over Fallujah and Ramadi, and I was there checking that out. And then Constant Hawk was mounted in a Shorts 330 aircraft that the Army leased.
Oh, wow.
They were operated out of Tikrit. And they flew missions to allow, and the resolution was good enough from altitude that in some cases you could actually track guys to where they had run to after an ambush.
Really?
Even though it was not designed to do that, I've seen it done. The problem with the guys is the resolution was high enough to track them if they were isolated, but if they merged with a crowd or went into a building, you could not then dig them out of clutter. So, I mean, there was Highlighter, which was a high resolution camera used for mapping, so that you could get better maps. I mean, there was a bunch of stuff. The Army created what the Air Force should have created was Task Force Odin. And they put a bunch of aviation assets into Tikrit as part of an aviation regiment that they stood up in 6 months, watched it happen. Should have been the Air Force doing that, wasn't. So I'm watching all this stuff happen, and you know, I'm not really happy with it. But the MC-12 is working. I focus on light attack, and I have a bit of a diversion, which finally allows me to get back in the fight. So the Army stood up around 2006-ish, the Asymmetric Warfare Group. And they actually gave them, the only building they had at Fort Meade to put them in was the prison. So they take a bunch of very high-speed dudes, the majority of whom are special forces background. Even their contractors, you know, as instructors, special forces background, really scarily high end. Some of the most capable and lethal guys we've ever produced. And when I say special forces, I mean Army special forces. I mean Green Berets and Delta, not the occasional clown act fielded by other services. And the asymmetric warfare group gets attention in Congress. I mean, it's a regiment. It's got 6 squadrons, I think. It's got a bunch of guys. And our chief of staff, General Mosley, at the time, is in front of a congressional panel, and they say, "Where's the Air Force asymmetric warfare group?" And he says, "We're standing one up now." That was bullshit. He made it up on the spot. And so what we end up with is the Coalition and Irregular Warfare Center at Nellis, the CWIC. And the CWIC, rather than being an entire regiment, is less than a dozen people. So, but it's a joint unit. It's also with the Australians, because we have an Australian. So why not throw him in there? It's Spike Davies, super genius, excellent dude, comes from an AWACS background, but is one of those people who you drop him in any environment and give him a task, and if he doesn't know how to do the task, he'll learn how to do the task, and then he will do the task expertly and well. So Spike is our Australian. You know, we end up having a boomerang on the patch. You'll see a picture with the patch later. And we're off, man. We have a Coalition and Irregular Warfare Center. And they grab Scott Pugmire, who is about to retire. Scott Pugmire is a amazing dude. He is a helicopter pilot. He came out of the special ops helicopter environment. He's just finished being a group commander. He's about to retire. He's a colonel, and he extends his retirement for a year to start up the Irregular Warfare Center. And I end up as initial cadre. I'm their only reservist, because it's another time where I need a job, and Mike Warden gives me a job. General Warden is now commander of the Air Warfare Center, and he gives me the job because I'm tired of what I've been doing. Because again, I'd been told, thanks for your interest in national defense in the Pentagon, and I'd been fired. And you know, it was time to move on. And so I email him and say, "Hey, I need a job." And the next thing I know, I'm part of the Coalition and Irregular Warfare Center. All 8 of us. And that's General Mosley's answer to the asymmetric warfare group, is a bunch of guys at Nellis Air Force Base. So, okay, great. Well, Scott Pugmire gets us off. What do? We go to Columbia. We go to Columbia to do an air power assessment. This is awesome, because now it is teaching me how to do an air power assessment of a force. And the Colombian Air Force is really, really good. So through the Clinton years, Clinton administration, America had funded Plan Colombia to help stabilize Colombia. It was $1 billion a year effort. It was major. Colombia was a major recipient of foreign aid, and it encompassed all kinds of things in numbers of departments. So the Air Force helped the Air Force, the State Department worked on the police force, Army helped the Army. Wildly successful. So when I went down there in 2007, the Air Force was looking at the next steps. What do we do next? We have some aircraft aging out. We have too many aircraft and too few maintainers. At the time, the Colombians were operating 50 some odd different varieties of airplanes.
Really?
Yes, some were leftover, some they had seized from drug runners. It was a maintenance nightmare. So where the Air Force average at the time was 7 maintainers per tail number, Colombians had 3 maintainers per tail number. But they have some tax money. They had a special war tax that they put against the rich folks that garnered them just shy of $200 million US. They wanted to know what they should do, how they consolidate. So they asked the U.S. Air Force for help. Scott Pugmire, it turns out, one of his previous assignments is he was a Mormon missionary in Colombia. Speaks fluent Colombian Spanish, knows everybody, was also the defense attaché in Colombia, was his previous assignment. So we go back with this team. We get diplomatic passports. We go through the airport in the diplomatic queue. I mean, no problem. Walk off the airplane, walk through a building. That's it. Flash your passport at the dude, you're in.
Wow.
We're staying at a hotel in downtown Columbia. We're going to the Colombian Air Force headquarters. General Ballesteros is the chief of staff. He's running the show. General Ballesteros, another super smart guy, fluent in English, but doesn't let you know it. Okay. So if he needs to, he brings it out. Okay. But he doesn't necessarily bring it out. So we're trying to do all this in Spanish. So I'm bringing up my high school Spanish, and I remember, and the only people that are going to think this story is funny are people who actually speak Spanish. But I'm going to tell anyway. So we're having the welcome speech, and I'm kind of following it along. He's doing it in Spanish. I'm following it along up to the point where he says, "We will provide you with all the chicken you need to do the mission." And I'm done. Okay. I have suddenly realized that he probably did not just offer us all the chicken we can eat. And I lose the whole thread of the discussion at this point, trying to figure out what the hell I've just blown in my vocabulary. The word he used is apoyo, APOYO, which means help or assistance in Spanish. So what he's saying is, we'll give you all the help you need to do the mission. What I hear is apoyo, a new word, POLLO, the chicken. So he's just offered me the chicken, and I have no idea mentally where to go from here. But, we start work, and I'm the TAC Air guy. I'm the fighter guy. That's my job. And we start visiting Colombian Air Force bases left and right. They are really good Air Force. They were really good at their processes. They were better at counterinsurgency in 2007 than we were in 2007. They had some sneaky systems, and I aren't going to talk about. They had some really cool systems. They were using the Super Tucanos because they'd used Tucanos beforehand. They had the AC-47 Phantasma gunships, okay, which are fantastic aircraft, re-engined, turboprop, DC-3s with guns sticking out the side that are also their airborne command posts. Right. They had the Arpia helicopter gunships, which are not based on Apaches. They're made on Blackhawks, and it's a Blackhawk bristling with guns. So it's got forward-firing GAU-19 50 caliber Gatling guns, rocket pods, door guns, and window guns. That everything's 50 cal except for the window guns, which are 7.62. And I'm asking, it's like, why do you have the additional 7.62 window guns? It's like, well, it's in case we crash and we run out of 50 caliber ammunition. Now we've got the 7.62 to keep the guys off our airframe while rescue shows up. Because Colombia has really good combat rescue dudes. They are the ones that annually the Air Force has a combat rescue competition in Florida. And the only foreigners I know of who regularly participate are Colombian PJs. Because they're fantastic. I mean, these are guys who amaze our guys. I remember hearing a story about a dude giving an IV to a simulated survival in a helicopter at night under NVGs. I mean, this is really spiffy stuff because your NVGs don't focus well at that close of a range. So we're in Colombia, we're eating Colombian food, everything is good. The Colombians have rolled out the red carpet. I'm learning an enormous amount, both how to do an assessment and how to run an Air Force. So let me just throw up a couple slides. All right, so that's where we left off. Super Tucano. I'm at Apia Air Base, and here's a Super Tucano. And you will note, by the way, that those bombs that are laying around as part of the static display have yellow stripes. Okay, so live munitions is part of the static display. That aircraft is combat loaded and prepped. They could have moved the bombs in front of it, pulled the chocks, powered it up, and rolled off and gone on a mission if they needed it. And they're showing us the Super Tucano. So that's where really what I'm thinking about for OAX. This kind of nails it. This is it. The Colombians are doing light attack. And, some of their aircraft had the sensor ball. And now that's where really light attack got its kickoff. Now you can see here I am, 2007, working in the building. Somebody took the photo from the Air Warfare Center. I've got the flags in the background. I'm a lieutenant colonel looking a little young. Just in case anybody has any doubts about my call sign. Oops. And those are my two Columbia pictures, okay? Because I don't want to reveal Colombian Air Force capabilities in detail, but we saw the A-37 Dragonflies. We saw their OV-10 Broncos, which were all grounded because they had them re-engined. And there was too much power. They bent all the airframes.
Oh, really?
Yes. So their upgrade program for the OV-10s killed their OV-10s, which they loved, because the Basler, I believe, no, it wasn't Basler. It was a turboprop engine. It was some fly-by-night U.S. modification company that was later indicted for violation of export controls. That's who the Colombians paid, and they ended up with overpowered, and it bent their airframes, and they had to retire all their OV-10s.
Wow.
But we learned a lot. We fed data, and I'm going to tell a story about a conversation with General Ballesteros, because they had flown Mirage 3s. They had a laser-guided capability with their Mirages, and they were looking at the Kafirs, but the laser-guided capability was important to them, but I thought that they should buy the ex-Royal New Zealand Air Force Skyhawks, reconfigure them into the Argentine configuration, which had an air-to-air radar. Okay, the New Zealand ones had the APG-66 version for the Skyhawk, but didn't have all the air-to-air modes. The Argentine A4M had the air-to-air modes. So that's what I wanted them to buy, the New Zealand ones, and they could have done this for a song, perfectly capable to do a refit. And General Ballesteros says, I can't do it. And I said, why? He says, because it's not macho enough. Now, you might immediately dismiss that, but when he went on to explain, this is why I know his English is really good, because I could not have carried on this conversation in Spanish, is he says, the way we develop our pilots is your retirement pay is based not on time and service, it is based on accumulated flight time. So I start out my pilots where they're fast jet guys. They go through the trainers, they go to a fast jet because it's macho and they need to be supersonic. And then all those guys realize that they're only building hours, 9/10 of an hour at a flight, and they move into the transports. So now they have to fly transports in order to build their hours. So it wasn't, a bad idea. It was the way Colombia develops their pilot force, is you start out in fast jets because it's macho and their pilots are young and stupid. Okay? And as they get older, they build their time and hours. So their long service pilots have service in multiple aircraft types. Not just fighters, but they've flown a bunch of stuff because you're building your retirement pay and you need flight hours.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why they ended up going with Kafirs as their upgrade, because it was the cheapest way to get them, and the Israelis were giving them a fire sale. And F-16s were just too expensive, because we could have given them Block 30 F-16s for free, but to bring them up on the midlife upgrade was still a ridiculous amount of money. So the F-16 wasn't an option. Anyway, learned how to do an aircraft assessment. This will come in useful later in Afghanistan. So now I'm in the Irregular Warfare Center. I've just done a successful trip. We generate a bunch of reports, and I've been bitching that the Air Force does not know enough about Army operations, because we don't have a guy in Army's Task Force Odin. While our JTACs are reporting things up the chain, it's coming up through a chain not designed to move intelligence information. And our JTACs are weapons employment experts in their field. They are not experts in the general employment of air power. They're not themselves aviators. Hugely useful, very talented. But you can't use them as an intel source. So I had said we need to send instructor aviators in on the ground in the walk a mile in another man's shoes. And General Worden sells this to General Mattis. And the next thing I know, it's like, hey, you're going to Baghdad. And it's like, great, finally. So 2007, I'm going to Baghdad. And there were different constituencies involved in this who were trying to pull me different ways. So the Nick Gritty, Lieutenant Colonel, later Colonel Nick Gritty, call sign Nitty, is now in charge of this at Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina. Another full-time reservist, another really talented guy. So Nitty is going to be my handler. And I'm going to go and embed with the counter IED task force in the Al-Faw Palace in Baghdad. So I need some combat skills training, and I hook up with the asymmetric warfare group. And the asymmetric warfare group, again, high-speed guys. I go through the same combat skills training, and I did not know who these guys were, because I would have been hugely intimidated. I am not easily intimidated. I would estimate that half of the instructor cadre was Delta or retired Delta. These guys are amazing, and they're teaching shoot, move, communicate, medicate skills that I still have today. And I'm extremely proud of all the, silly competitions that I've done. I did 2 pistol competitions with the asymmetric warfare group, and I won them both. And the first one was basically shooting orange-sized targets. I hit 6, 7 orange-sized targets with a pistol in 7 seconds. 6 rounds, 6 hits, 7 seconds. The next closest guy was the FBI guy at 21 seconds. And then I did another pistol competition where the command sergeant major and I both tied with a perfect score every round in the 10 ring. But he wasn't allowed to compete, so I got a little certificate for like the Johnny Rocket pistol competition. One of the lead instructor, Pat McNamara, was everything you want in a human being as far as talent goes. Musical talent, Olympic class athlete, amazing marksman, really high end kind of dude. But he would give out these little award pieces of paper on Xerox where he'd make up this long name full of words strung together. And I've got one of them, and I'm proud of it. It goes up on my I Love Me wall. This freaking folded piece of Xerox paper is up on the wall when I reestablish it. Anyway, they taught me a lot of important stuff, and that's how I hooked up with the asymmetric warfare group. They helped me with supply, and I went into Al Udeid on the way, and the Al Udeid guys try to stop me. They try to make me stay at Al Udeid and do my IED work from there, because that's where the Air Force, could keep their thumb on me. If I go forward into Baghdad, they can't keep a thumb on me. So I managed to escape them, and this puts me in situations where I have to like beg a rifle from the Army because the Air Force, you don't need a rifle. You're never going to go outside the wire. Of course I'm going to go outside the wire. I mean, what the hell? So, and the asymmetric warfare group would have set me up with everything I needed, but I was confident that I could force the Air Force to do the right thing. I could not. I ended up begging equipment from the Army. I ended up buying my own armor because the Air Force armor was garbage. Mm-hmm. I go out and we go to the Alpha Palace. So let me bring this up again, because I am now embedded in an Army task force. And the Army rules are pretty much the Army is joint. Okay. Therefore, all joint activities must support the Army because the Army is inherently joint. So it's like we're the kings, and all of you fuckers, you're all support assets. Okay, that's what you do. You support the Army. This is an Army mission, Army 4 stars everywhere. So I go into the Alpha Palace. The Alpha Palace is off to the west of Baghdad. It's surrounded by man-made lakes, palm trees, swimming pools, resorts. So naturally, when the U.S. Army takes something over, they take over the resort facilities because they also had the least number of bomb damaged, right? Buildings, although we did hit a lot of palaces. The Army will set up in a bombed out palace, some 2x4s and plywood, and suddenly, it's the place you set up your headquarters. Add electricity, and it's good to go. So the Alpha Palace, the luxury, that's where General Petraeus was. And lovely architecture, gold freaking toilets.
Really?
Now, yeah, I do not have any pictures of the gold toilets because taking a camera into a men's room is wrong. I don't care who you are or where you are. And I'm actually proud of once having fixed a gold-plated toilet with a Leatherman because it was running, water was running, and water is a limited asset. It can't have a running toilet. And so I open up the back of this gold freaking plated toilet, fix it with a Leatherman.
So this is one of Saddam's palaces then?
Oh yeah, this is one of Saddam's palaces. Yeah. So let's bring up a couple of slots again. All right, so this is the Alpha Palace. Okay, pretty spiffy. You take that causeway out, so we've got gates at the outside of the causeway. It's essentially surrounded by a moat. It's pretty secure. That's where the 4 stars go, and the 4 stars bring their own cooks. There are a couple important things here. One is the toilet paper quality in the Alpha Palace is better than any place else. They get high quality toilet paper, and everybody else gets gets pink pony toilet paper, which might as well be recycled splinter board. So, if you time it right and you actually have an office in the Alpha Palace, you can minimize your use of pink pony toilet paper because they've got the good stuff, because this is where the generals are. It was also General Order Number 1. General Order Number 1 covered a bunch of things. One is no alcohol. Okay, you could not have alcohol in theater. You couldn't drink it. You could also not have sex in theater. Which they actually applied even to married couples deployed to the same base, which is blatantly unlawful. You can't do that.
Wow.
Military command doesn't have the authority to do that. But the biggest source of Article 15s was actually improper relationships and alcohol use, and a lot of women officers and women enlisted, because the Australians operated the only swimming pool. And they wouldn't allow Americans to use it unless the Americans were A, hot, and B, wearing a bathing suit. So I overheard a couple of generals saying their biggest discipline problem was all the Article 15s they were handling out for unauthorized activities at the Australian pool. So, the Aussies are doing their Australian thing. And at the time, since I was part of a combined U.S. Australian unit, all I can say is good on them. The other thing is that the no alcohol rule did not apply to general officers, and I did not realize this until well after. Just, within the last 5 years, I met one of the logistics NCOs whose job was to supply liquor to the senior officers in the Alpha Palace.
Wow. How do they justify that?
There are no morals in the Pentagon, and there were definitely no morals in the Alpha Palace. So that's a shot I took shortly after arrival. I'm not actually angry.
That's ridiculous.
I am concentrating. Pardon?
It's ridiculous. You look about 12 years old.
See, that's why I included the picture. Okay, this is my lean, mean fighting machine. This is 2007. I'm wearing my 150 mission patch on my right shoulder. I've got a skunk on my name tag as a skunkwork alums. I'm carrying my sidearm. And my sidearm, you can also see what looks like a pair of scissors. That's a hemostat. That's a clamp.
Ooh.
I always carried that was one of the things that special ops medics taught me. I went everywhere with clamps, because if you had arterial bleeding, that was we didn't have hemostatic bandages at the time. In non-fighter manner, I still have my Peter pocket on my flight suit because there's a knife in there. And there's also a knife on my holster. And one of the ammo pouches, I would often carry a toothbrush and toothpaste in there in case I didn't feel like I needed, a whole bunch of ammo. But I've got my Camelback, my camera, and I'm just taking a picture in the Alpha Palace. This is another view because I need a bicycle. Okay, there are 54 miles of hard surface roads in this camp complex that you can go on without repeating yourself. Ask me how I know this.
Go on.
So I go to the BX and I buy this cheap mountain bike, and I have my wife send me out my Air Force cycling jersey, and I have you'll see in this photo, if you were to zoom in, you'd see that I have my Camelback, which also has my sidearm, first aid, spare ammo, and water. So even cycling, you have to have your sidearm everywhere. So when I first arrived, I'm going to go hit the chow hall. I lock up my sidearm. I go to the chow hall. They won't let me in. You've got to be armed to eat. So I go back to, the tent I was staying in. I unlock my firearm. I come back wearing a sidearm. They let me eat in the chow hall. So this is a way, if you're Army and you lose control of your firearm, you have to fess up or starve.
Yeah.
So I'm everywhere. I'm everywhere with a sidearm. Cycling with a sidearm. This bike was later hit and then put back into service. It was hit by a 240 millimeter rocket. So off to the right side of the photo where you can't see was where the bike racks were. And one day I'm in the Alpha Palace. I'm on a phone call with Nitty Gritty back at Shaw Air Force Base. And I hear this kaboom. And it rattles the whole palace. And I just, let it go because, rocket attacks are routine. We're going to talk more about rocket attacks in a bit. And so I'm on the phone call and somebody comes in and says, yeah, that rocket just hit the bike rack. And I'm on the phone with Nitty. It's like, gotta go, dude. uranium is just rocketed a bike rack. Bang. And I hang up the phone. I go outside. Sure enough, freaking 240 millimeter rocket had landed next to the bike rack. And there are metal holes in my frame. I've still got some of the fragments I pulled out. My tires are flat. One of my wheels is shredded. And the Base Exchange will sell the bicycle. They will not sell spare parts. And at the time, they only sold spare inner tubes for bicycle models that they didn't carry. So they sell you road bike tubes, and all they sold was mountain bikes. That wasn't very handy. And so that's just to add up the visual relief to get off the bicycle. So I actually, salvaged guys from a soldier. He let me salvage part of his bike, and I ordered some by mail to put the bike back in service. But the soldier was despondent. He goes, man, the only thing I had here was this bicycle, and they just ruined it. I hate this place. So, I mean, the guy was despondent, but, that isn't going to stop me from asking him if I can salvage his bicycle so I can get mine back on the road. So this is one of the mosques in the complex. Again, water around it, great architecture, great colors, and so on. And that's Baghdad. We'll talk about Baghdad later. So I'm back. So that's me arriving in Baghdad. I'm planning on joining the ISR or the counter IED task force. I actually get moved into a shack where I have my own room with air conditioning. It's like a trailer. I still have to walk to the bathroom where I'm trying to avoid the pink pony toilet paper. And you still have to take your sidearm. And I've got the Air Force PT gear because that's what you wear when you're not in full uniform. You wear the PT gear, which doesn't have any freaking pockets. Okay. And so that's why I have to carry a toothpaste and toothbrush in my freaking ammo pouch, which goes on the holster because you're going to the bathroom with a sidearm, which means since you're not carrying it between your teeth, you've got your holster. So I might as well make good use of the ammo pouch and bring the toothbrush around for some personal hygiene. And my fear, and I still have nightmares about this today, I have never lost control of a firearm. I still have recurring nightmares where I can't account for my pistol and my rifle. And my biggest worry was always dropping a pistol into a porta potty and having to recover it. So it's double super. I mean, it's locked into its holster. The holster's on a belt. This is not an easy drop, but I'm taking it off and I'm securing it 6 different ways and I'm hanging it up and making sure it's far away from anything where it could possibly drop. But I still have recurring nightmares about not being able to account for firearm, and chief among those is dropping my freaking sidearm in a porta potty. But in the meantime, I'm racking up uniform violations. And so, we go through uniform violations. The first one is the PT uniform. The rules are it can be tucked in or not tucked in. I wore it not tucked in because who tucks in, a t-shirt, a reflective t-shirt into running shorts? The U.S. Air Force, that's who. So tucked in. So I get informed on this. So now I got to tuck it in. Okay. Then you can't have your sleeves rolled up. I have my sleeves rolled up all the time. Okay. And you're allowed to roll them up. They teach you how to roll your sleeves in basic training. You can't roll up your sleeves. I don't know why you can't roll up your sleeves when it's 112 or 120 freaking degrees, but in Baghdad, you can't roll up your sleeves. So this is all sergeant major kind of stuff, right? So, but it does cut down on your sunscreen use. So floppy hats. I come in wearing a flight suit, desert flight suit. I have my Desert Storm floppy hat. My first lieutenant flopping hat, chocolate chip, camouflage pattern. I'm informed early that I cannot wear it. Okay. And I had checked, is the pattern still authorized for U.S. military use? Yes. But I'm informed by sergeants majors that I cannot wear it in Iraq because they issued a bunch of them to the Iraqis, the chocolate chip pattern, and they don't want confusion. So it's like, right. So this 5'11" pasty white complexion, Northern European descent, 05 in a flight suit with a chocolate chip hat is going to be mistaken for an Iraqi. Well, one, the Iraqis don't put 12-year-olds in uniform, so that was one discriminator, but all the others, I mean, it should have been. Nope. So, uniform violation number 3. And for the floppy hat, when you take off the floppy hat, I would hang it on my back by the strap. Strap goes around my neck, but you can't do that in Iraq. It's a choking hazard. You've got to, you got to stuff your hat in a pocket. Okay. But You can't have your floppy hat look like a cowboy hat. Do I have my floppy hat? I don't have it handy. You can't have it look like a cowboy hat where the sides are turned up. But what happens when you fold it lengthwise and shove it into a flight suit leg pocket? Hey, it goes into a cowboy shape. So instead, you have to wad it into this little ball and walk around with this protruding pocket. And it's like, is that a grapefruit in your pocket? Or are you happy to see me? So there's some uniform violations. And t-shirts. So t-shirts, brown t-shirts. And you saw the photo, I'm wearing a brown t-shirt. Or black ones with desert flight suits. So I had the new Airman Battle Uniform, the tiger stripes. Now, this is the dumbest idea ever. The Airman Battle Uniform was tiger stripe pattern stolen from Vietnam. And originally it was the Smurf uniform. And it was 3 shades of blue. And it was being trial worn as 3 shades of blue camouflage. And the 2 things that killed it, one was a PowerPoint presentation that went around that had been photoshopped that was an Airman JTAC in a line of Army soldiers in Afghanistan. And the Smurf blue uniform had been photoshopped on this guy. And he's got a thought bubble over his head saying, yeah, man, I'm sure glad I have my new uniform, where you've got all the squad of soldiers in their green and tan uniform, and you have this one guy in 3-tone blue. So that damaged the uniform. And the other thing was later 4-star General Frank Gorenk, who was freaking awesome. He is like a 6'4", broad-shouldered snowplow of a human being with no respect for personal space. Great guy, really smart, worked for him for a couple of times. I think he's a really great dude. And he won't admit this, but I think he went on a mission to completely destroy the 3-tone blue tiger stripe uniform by wearing it everywhere as one of the demo wearers and being super enthusiastic about it in public. And those 2 events kind of killed it. So when we now match the tiger stripes with the Army colors, but still tiger stripes, man, that's for lying down in long grass in Southeast Asia. So anyway, so I got I've got my t-shirts, the uniform tiger stripes. What color? So I black. Nope, I'm not right. The only color authorized is sand. Okay, but the only sand colored t-shirts you can buy in theater are 50% polyester and 50% cotton, which means they're flammable, which is okay because your uniform is flammable. And the thing with polyester is it melts. So when this stuff catches fire, it melts into your skin. We had a number of airmen seriously injured. The Airman Battle Uniform was absolutely unsuited for combat use. I'm still salty about this because we did seriously injure some of our folks sending them to battle in this uniform. It was also too heavy, too hot, had stupid pockets, and couldn't be worn under armor. So I ditched it early. So I went to the flight suit. Okay, but polyester combat uniforms, not bad. So I had to buy, instead of being able to get a cotton freaking t-shirt at 3 to a pack for $9, I had to buy sand-colored, silver-impregnated Nomex t-shirts at $45 a pop. And I point out, I paid less than that for a 3-piece suit in Turkey. Although, admittedly, my wife says they made me look like a Bulgarian Secret Service agent. Okay, so hats. Hat problem again, right? So at Asymmetric Warfare Group, running around in the field wearing a helmet, lost my issued floppy hat. Okay, because I was wearing a helmet. Can you get replacements? No. And it was a ball cap version of camouflage hat. Can you get a floppy hat? No, they haven't been manufactured. But the Army hats are the same colors, right? Slightly different patterns. So I get some Army floppy hats, but you can't wear them. They're not allowed. Only the Air Force hat is authorized for the Air Force uniform. But you can't get an Air Force hat, and I can't get a replacement. So what do? Well, you can't not have a hat, so you just have to wear the Army hat. But only the Garrison Army hat, okay, which is designed for Germany in November, not the floppy hat designed for a son. Okay, because there's sun in Iraq in August, but you can't wear the floppy Army hat because it might show that the officer corps actually has a freaking brain and aren't a bunch of pointless detail-absorbed yahoos. So, uniform violation. And boots, desert boots don't need to be shined, so there should be no boot issues. Except I have a Leatherman on my right boot. I have for years, because if you eject and you still have your foot, when you land, you have a Leatherman on your bootlaces. but no boot knives allowed, and the Leatherman has a blade. It's a boot knife. So there's a uniform violation. Now, this was all sergeant major kind of thing, but no sergeant major or chief ever addressed me on this issue. It was only people pointing me out that the sergeant's major would be mad. So, so the uniform, the only time a chief actually yelled at me was I was riding by on a bike in my flight suit, by the way, and he yelled out something like, "Put your hat on." And I turned right around and stopped and had a discussion with the sergeant major in question about tone. It's like, I didn't realize you were an officer. It's like, I'm wearing a flight suit. Okay, I'm on a bicycle and you're addressing me inappropriately in public. So it's one of the few times when I got to rip a chief up and down one side and the other.
What was his response?
He didn't have a good one. It was, well, sir, I was just trying to enforce the uniform regs. He said, it's a stupid uniform reg. I was on a freaking bicycle. I had uniform, and I would usually go to the regulation and win. So that's my introduction to Iraq, and we've only got about 9 minutes left. So I want to give you an opportunity for questions, because we're obviously going to go into the next part, which is the operations in Iraq, when I talk about IEDs and command wire and running around in MRAPs.
I suppose my big question, bearing in mind we don't have that much time, is actually to there's a lot of levity in your storytelling, but I want to bring it back to, as I often do, to some more serious sort of talking or thinking or consideration around mortality. So you're going to Iraq, and I know that there were periods of time where it was more dangerous and less dangerous to be in Iraq, and I don't really know the history, and there were points at which early on the coalition forces were hailed as liberators, and then soon after we were then considered occupiers, and so it became more dangerous. But you've talked about how excited you were about getting there. How does how are you approaching it emotionally? How are you approaching the fact you're actually going to war zone? You're going to be on the ground. People are getting killed by IEDs. People are being engaged. There are insurgents. They're throwing rockets into compounds. And your previous experience of combat, of course, has been slightly different, because although you have been in mortal danger, it's been at arm's length, so to speak. Someone can send a missile up to kill you and shoot you down. But this is different. You may end up getting separated. You may end up on your own. I just want to understand how, emotionally, how were you?
So I'm showing up at the right end of this chart, which I will now do away with. So it was fairly dangerous. Emotionally, I have been given the opportunity that I prize more than any other, and that is the opportunity to run to the sound of the guns. So there is stuff that needs to be done. I can do it. I will learn how to do things. I mean, I'm a fighter guy who is learning. In the next episode, I'm going to embed with combat engineers and infantry and MPs on operations outside the wire, and I will embed as a rifleman. I will do it at the platoon or the squad level. That's I will be going outside the wire. I will see IEDs. I will see them not explode. I will see them explode. We will encounter the occasional ambush, mortar fire. We will drag vehicles back after hits. That's just this sounds incredibly self-centered and arrogant. This is what Starbaby did. I mean, it's not for everybody. I really enjoyed operations. I came out of my ops in Iraq and Afghanistan realizing that by making a career decision to avoid a JTAC or an air liaison officer role, that I had locked myself out of a whole bunch of activities that were useful and fun. I liked running around with a rifle. Despite the dust, the toxic exposure, the occasional high velocity fragments, I came out of it remarkably unscathed. Which means I was lucky. I mean, there's some talent in there, and some, caution, because one of the advantage I have over a private first class rifleman is I have a lot more situational awareness. Okay, and I have better awareness of the tools I can use to manage a situation. But there's still a lot of luck involved. And it was just what I did.
Okay.
I was thrilled to be there. I had a mission. I needed to make it better. The objective was to reduce the threat using air power to the people that actually had placed the boots on the ground. And in order to do that, the case I had made to General Warden and the case he had made to General Mattis was we needed to put an instructor aviator, boots on the ground, at the rifleman level to get an understanding. Because this led to a bunch of reports. And my outbrief from Iraq, General Mattis had it. I mean, it crossed services. It went to the 4-star and theater command level. So much that when I went back to Afghanistan, TRADOC, the Army Training and Doctrine Command, actually sent me forward with a couple of things they wanted to look at, because they knew that whatever I came up with would get 4-star attention. And it did. And so, yeah, it was, that's just something you do. I mean, I did not know before showing up in Iraq that 107 millimeter is a rocket caliber. Had no idea. By the time I left Iraq, I could identify them by sound in all phases of flight. And I got 2 rocket stories I'll tell in the next episode.
Okay.
One that has a photo. But that was the route I took. And the reason this bizarre kind of episode actually strings together is this is a journey where we have a changing set of combat conditions. And I am unhappy with the Air Force's response. And I'm trying to improve the Air Force's response through all the starts and stops in a variety of areas of air power. I'm trying to do it in reconnaissance. I'm trying to do it in light attack. I'm trying to do it in forward presence. And I have good support by leadership at the 1- and 2-star level that enables me to go to places where Air Force officers and particularly aviators did not go. I dig it.
Okay. Well, that answers the question, sets the scene for the next episode. I'm looking forward to it. All right.
Yeah, so I hope this, this isn't terribly aviation centric, but it does have, plenty of airplane discussion in it and the occasional picture and stupid uniform stories. And then next episode we'll talk about Iraq and may make it into Afghanistan because of depending on the time limit I am with another set of pictures where I'll show you, being out on patrol, the command wire stuff we found, stuff we did, things that exploded. I'll tell stories about what happens when a lieutenant colonel embeds himself in a rifle squad where the senior NCO is a staff sergeant. There are no officers. Hijinks ensue.
Looking forward to it, Starbaby. Thanks for doing part 1. Looking forward to part 2.
Part 1, and however many parts I can milk this for, so that I can get that, I can work towards getting that extra raise.
Well, that's...
10% of nothing is nothing. Carried the nothing. And for anybody who recognizes that quote, good on you.